All right, guys, so we're back talking about elephants and ivory. And if you remember from part 1, we left off talking about this ivory quota, right? And we talked about how the ivory quota worked. So countries are going to have a role in determining the quota, and they can also export stockpiled ivory, something that's a little difficult to monitor, right? We don't know where your stockpiles came from. So they gave this quota an attempt, and remember we said that quotas can work. We use quotas, for example, on sugar. We have quotas on how much foreign sugar we're going to import. And the quota works in terms of achieving what we want it to achieve, but we also do a good job monitoring the sugar quota. But with the ivory quota, we really saw lack of success. So this quota that they envisioned at the CITES meeting was unsuccessful. So they tried it, 3 years, unsuccessful. And what was the reason that they deemed it unsuccessful? Well, the obvious, they were still seeing high levels of illegal trade. So they're still seeing illegal trade in ivory. So this is problematic. Too many elephant kills. They're counting carcasses for one. So remember, when people poach, they're taking the ivory, but they're generally not harvesting the entire carcass. They're not taking the meat and the skin, because, right, if you're a poacher, are you going to sit there and do other things to try to use the rest of the elephant, or are you just going to get out of there, right? You don't want to be detected, so you're going to get the ivory and you're going to get out if you're poaching for ivory, right? So there are some methodologies for counting carcasses, and they do some of it using aerial monitoring, that kind of thing. But multiple reasons that we're going to talk about that the ivory quota wasn't successful. And one big problem with the ivory quota had to do with loopholes. There were just loopholes in the process. Add to that the lack of monitoring. So between loopholes and lack of monitoring, we have a real problem. Of course, if you're dealing with governments that are corrupt, you can imagine that it makes the problem even worse. So loopholes, lack of monitoring, corruption, and we have a problem. So it was determined that more than 80% of the commercial ivory trade was occurring outside of the ivory control system. So the ivory control system was the quota system. So there were reports that suggested that we had an overwhelmingly large amount of illegal ivory. More than 80% of the commercial ivory trade was outside or in excess of the quotas. And I found this in a document from the U.S. Department of Interior. So this is 1989, right, at the end of this 3-year experiment. So let's talk about the loopholes. The first loophole that we want to mention is what we call the loophole for worked ivory. Worked ivory. So worked ivory, guys, is ivory that's carved into art. And originally, this type of ivory, anything that was carved into art, was not counted against the quota. So the quota didn't include this worked ivory. And so somebody asked the other day, what do people want for ivory for? Well, ivory is used for beautiful sculptures, statues, just incredible. And so here's an example of worked ivory. But this loophole, and at the time it wasn't really a loophole, they realized it became a loophole, it distorted people's incentives. So let's think about this for a second. You're a poacher, or you're distributing illegal ivory. How might you utilize this exception? What might you do here? What might you do to try to make your ivory look legal. Because if it's worked, it's legal, and you don't have to worry about the quota. You don't have to count it against the quota. What might you do, Montana?
I would just carve a little something.
Montana would just carve a little something in it, right? Carve a little something in it, and that's exactly what happened. The illegal traders started superficially carving this ivory. Now, were they trying to create art pieces? No. They were just trying to declare it as worked ivory, and when it got to the other end, somebody's going to cut it up, sand it down, whatever you do with ivory, and use it just as they would otherwise. So we have this loophole. So some of this illegal ivory trade was ivory that was made to look like it was worked, because then it didn't have to be counted against the quota. But technically that would be a legal ivory trade because it's not an art form. They're going to just use it for whatever. All right. The second concern is that countries were involved in setting their individual quotas. Countries were involved in setting their individual quotas. Now you remember from part 1, I showed you that document from CITES that said that countries had to submit in writing to the Secretariat their numbers. So they had a role in setting their individual quotas. Guys, is it possible that countries would have an incentive to distort their numbers? Absolutely. So, for example, you might be a country that says you have stockpiled ivory, but maybe you really don't have your own stockpile. So you say you have stockpiled ivory, but maybe you really don't. And then it would allow you to launder ivory from other nations. You could launder ivory. That seems so crazy to think about. But there's some evidence that this is what happens. So countries say, yeah, we've got stockpiles, so we're going to put in this much towards the quota. But they don't have it. They bring it in from other countries. Remember that ivory has to be stamped, right, with the country of origin. So they stamp it as if it's from their country, but it's really not. It's from across the border. There's also a cross-border poaching. So maybe you don't have any elephants. If you don't have any elephants, you don't need any share of this quota. You don't need to have a role in setting quotas, but you've got poaching going on across the border. You're bringing the ivory back to your country. So this is also problematic. So we have two kind of loopholes right here that cause problems. This worked ivory loophole, and then of course this role of countries in setting numbers that generated these quotas, but they have an incentive to distort, and we see some laundering taking place. So I found this great quote: Burundi has no elephants, but a large stock of ivory poached from neighboring Tanzania, blah, blah, blah. Burundi was actually accused of laundering. So how is it possible, if you are a country that is not home to elephants, that you could have a stockpile? And remember, we looked at some numbers and we showed that Burundi had part of the quota, right? They don't need part of the quota. They have no elephants. So where did this ivory come from? Tanzania. So again, the quota's a failure. It's not well conceived. There's problems. And to some degree, guys, is it a free rider problem? Is it a free rider problem? Yeah. So, hey, as long as you guys are doing the right thing, I can cheat a little bit. Right? It's almost like kind of the prisoner's dilemma for those of you who have had some game theory or saw that in one of your classes, right? If I'm the only one that's cheating, it's probably not going to be too problematic. But when we all cheat, not that everyone cheated, but if a lot of us cheat, then we're worse off. So We saw this slide already, and I've circled for you Burundi. No elephants, but yet 17,848 tusks in their stockpile. Shouldn't somebody maybe have questioned that? Shouldn't bells have gone off? Wait a minute, what's going on here? This makes no sense. So again, careless, not well conceived, not well monitored. We see problems. So as we said, a quota is only as good as its rules, folks. A policy is only as good as its monitoring. Bad rules, you have bad outcomes. And that's the problem here. There were bad rules. There were bad rules about how the quota would work. So bad rules give you bad outcomes. Only works if you have monitoring, good monitoring. Of course, you got to have an effective enforcement. So, bottom line, quota was a failure, something else needed to be tried. This isn't going to work, so something else needs to be tried. So remember, the quota was in 1986. It failed. Something else needed to be tried. So now we're in 1989. We see another CITES meeting. So in 1989, CITES meets again. They agree. Their 3-year experiment with the quota, it was a failure. Time to move on. So at this point in 1989, you have some CITES members successfully pushing for a ban on ivory. And that really should be ivory trade. A ban on ivory trade. So 1989, when we decide our quota is a failure, what do we discuss? A ban on ivory trade. Now, how would that ban on ivory trade come about? It would come about by putting the African elephant on the Appendix 1 listing. So how would they implement this ban? By putting the African elephant on the Appendix 1 listing. And you're going to learn more about CITES and the appendices, Appendix 1 and 2, and how that has influenced elephant outcomes, elephant policy and elephant outcomes. But as soon as a species is listed on the CITES Appendix 1, it's illegal to trade commercially. So Appendix 1 listings ban commercial trade. Now, the Asian elephants were put there in 1975. So remember I said we're talking about the African elephant because the situation with the Asian elephant is indeed a little bit different. They've been on Appendix 1. But that's how the ban came about. So CITES countries agreed in 1989 that they would list African elephants on Appendix 1, which bans commercial trade. All right. Now, as I said, you're going to learn more about that in another lecture. Interestingly, there was definitely support from some African nations. There was support from some African nations. And especially from the United States. And when you read about this, you'll probably see that the United States was very instrumental. That some people characterize it as the United States leading the charge here for the ban on ivory trade. But there was some flexibility added. The flexibility that was added in relation to this ban said that countries with growing elephant populations can later apply for permission to sell ivory from culling. So, countries with growing elephant populations can later apply for permission to sell ivory from culling. Now, guys, why do you think that this flexibility was added?
Add incentives to grow your population.
Incentives, right? And incentives, good. It gives you an incentive to find ways to successfully manage your elephant populations. So if you can be innovative and you can do a good job protecting your elephant populations, you will be rewarded with being able to sell off your ivory. That's a pretty big incentive, right? Well, that makes sense. But there were also some loopholes in this, and we'll talk more about this later. So the idea here then, getting back to the idea of the ban on ivory with this added flexibility that if you're doing a good job, we'll let you sell off ivory later. We'll talk more about that. So the idea here makes sense, right? So let's make ivory illegal to trade in most cases. There are some exceptions we'll talk about later. We're going to make ivory illegal to trade in most cases. But here's the deal, folks. One problem is that it's a ban on international trade. It's a ban on international trade. This is an international agreement. All countries have to agree. Remember, it's legally binding. If you're part of CITES, you're going to go with what is determined, but it doesn't apply to domestic trade. So domestic trade isn't covered by this ban. So trading within Thailand, trading within China, for example, isn't covered. But the whole idea is if we ban ivory trade, then we're eliminating the demand for ivory, right? Isn't that how it works? If we make something illegal, the demand goes away, yes? Do we agree with that? I see some of you saying yes, some of you saying no. Okay, some of you, Gracia, you're saying no, that's not how it works. Why? Why do you think that?
It's like people are still gonna find it. Like people still want it, so we're gonna find a way to get it.
People who want something are going to find a way to get it. Do we have any real world examples?
Illegal drugs.
Drugs, guns, right? Drugs. So we've made drugs illegal, and it eliminated the demand, right? It did? Nick, you're on your head. So we made drugs illegal, and it's eliminated the demand?
The wrong way.
Okay. You're just confused. So, yeah, I mean, do we agree we've made drugs illegal, and demand certainly has not gone away? At one point, we experimented with what? Making what illegal? Alcohol, right? And we know that when we made alcohol illegal during Prohibition, demand went away, right? Nobody was producing alcohol. Nobody was drinking alcohol, right? So it doesn't take much economics to know that, you can ban something, but if it's of value to people, what's going to happen, guys? What do we create? A black market. So the thought, as we said, was we're going to eliminate trade. It's going to eliminate the demand for ivory. It's going to eradicate or at least substantially reduce poaching. But we know that's not how it works, because if we look back at our lessons from Prohibition of alcohol, and if we look at our war on drugs, we know this is not the case. So I don't understand how a whole bunch of really intelligent people could say, yeah, when we ban it, it goes away, right? I mean, it doesn't take much to look at history and know that this does not work. Instead, when we make things illegal, what do? We create a black market, right? And so when we create a black market, think about the black market for drugs. How would we characterize the black market for drugs?
Big money.
It's big money, right? So it's highly lucrative. What else?
It's not really that hard to get what you want.
Okay, pretty accessible. What else? Safe, dangerous? Pretty dangerous, right? Can we monitor it very easily?
No.
Can we regulate it? No. So you create black markets, which makes life difficult because you can't monitor it. You can't enforce things. And most importantly, if we have a black market for ivory, prices go up, right? Prices go up. And if prices go up, what's wrong with that? What's the problem there?
Learn somewhere else.
Ah, it's more lucrative to poach, right? So your incentives to poach go up. So this ban on ivory clearly has some big drawbacks. And it certainly has not eliminated poaching, although we'll see from the data that we've seen maybe, a little bit of movement, but then we screwed it up after that, and I'll tell you more about that. Now, interestingly, guys, when this came up for a vote, I was able to find years ago that the vote was 76 for and 11 against. So was it unanimous? Definitely not, but pretty overwhelmingly in favor of the ban, right, when we look globally. But when we look at Africa, the vote's 9 for and 9 against. So much more split, right? So much more overwhelmingly in favor when we look at all of the people voting relative to Africa. Yeah.
This is 19.
What did I say?
9.
I said 9 for, 9 against. Well, whatever I said, I meant to say, apologize, 19 for, 9 against. All right? So, in my reading of CITES rules, what I read was that you needed 2/3 to pass, so it's not just simple majority. 2/3 have to be in favor of something for it to be adopted by CITES, because remember, if you're a member of CITES, it's binding. Doesn't matter if you're not in favor of it. If you're a member of CITES, it's binding. So we vote for the ban, 2/3 vote, then it's a done deal. But this was out of 102 nations at the time, so that suggests that there's some why can I not say it? Some abstentions is what I'm trying to say. Gosh, some abstentions here. Okay, so maybe some nation said, like, look, I don't have a dog in this hunt. I'm going to leave it to people who have more at stake. Maybe they think that this is something that really Africa should be deciding on, and they abstained from the vote. So I don't know who abstained. But what I do want to think about is who in Africa might be opposed to banning ivory trade. Who might be opposed to banning trade, Nick?
Tanzania.
Tanzania. Why Tanzania?
They have a large elephant population.
Okay, Tanzania has a large elephant population, which means, what's in it for Tanzania?
A lot of money. A lot of economic benefit.
So a lot of money by their stockpiles of ivory, right? Now, remember, can you get stockpiles in legal means? Yeah. So we're not trying to necessarily suggest that they're like wanting people to poach their elephants and whatever, but we showed in some graphics in part 1 that there are a lot of deaths by natural causes of elephants. The ivory is harvested, it's put into storage, it's stockpiled. So basically, a country like Tanzania that feels like it's got a big elephant population and stockpiled ivory, by banning trade, what are we doing to a country like that? We're removing a huge source of revenue for their country, right? A huge source of revenue. So included in this list of countries that were against, and this is going to be interesting because you're going to kind of see these names, some of these names again, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Namibia, Swaziland, and Tanzania. Now, some of those names are going to come back, and you're exactly right. These are countries At least most of these. I don't know anything about Swaziland, but I know about the others. Healthy elephant populations, or at least big elephant populations, stockpiles of ivory. They don't want to lose access to that source of funding. That makes sense. So basically, these countries argued that, number one, we're doing a good job of managing our populations. So number one, they're saying, look, we are doing a good job at managing our populations. In fact, we're going to talk about Zimbabwe because they had just implemented this cool, innovative program that we're going to discuss. So we're doing a good job with our elephant populations. Don't punish us. Number two, they had stockpiles of ivory that were legal. Stockpiled ivory that was legal. It wasn't from poaching. Of course, it's hard to monitor and know that for sure. But they're arguing that they have legal stockpiles of ivory. Three, they're arguing that elephant conservation is expensive and they need the money for elephant conservation. So if you don't let us sell our stockpiled ivory, you're eliminating an important source of revenue for us that we can use to protect our elephants. Probably valid arguments. So that's going to become more relevant a few years later after the ban is implemented. So the problem is that there's also criticisms of these countries who are saying, hey, we're doing a good job. You're kind of taking advantage of us. We have stockpiled ivory. We're doing a good job with our management of elephants. Some of these criticisms include that there was some pretty sleazy crap going on. For example, one article I found talked about that there were these creations of artificial watering holes put in place by Zimbabwe. Why? Those artificial watering holes were enticing elephants to come across the border from Botswana and move on to Zimbabwe. So they're trying to lure other countries' elephants onto their land. Which means then those elephants get counted twice. They count in Botswana's counts, because sometimes they're on Botswana's lands, but they're coming over to Zimbabwe's land and they're ending up in the counts. So Zimbabwe's benefiting. They're doing this to try to get their elephant numbers up. So that's interesting and clearly deceptive. So some people are saying, okay, wait a minute. Your numbers aren't necessarily reliable. You're doing some pretty shady things trying to make it look like your elephant populations are different than they might actually be. Then there's lots of criticisms about some of the funds were actually not channeled to elephant conservation, but they were channeled to rebel armies. So where the funds are going, there's some criticism there. So channeling of some of this money, not to elephant conservation, but to rebel armies. Then there's some evidence of poaching in neighboring countries to obtain more ivory to sell. So you go across the borders, you poach, you bring the ivory back, you put it in your stockpile. That would be illegally obtained ivory. And then not necessarily giving money to rebel armies, but just misuse of funds. That the funds are supposed to go to elephant conservation. That's why you're saying you want the funds, but they just don't get used for that. Instead, they flow into the treasury, and they're used towards the general budget. Again, that's not a horrible thing, but not the point of being allowed to sell stockpiled ivory. So I found this study, and it's a bit sophisticated, but I want to kind of just show you a couple things. Now, Since the ban, let's take a look. This ban was in 1999. So I wish I had put another red line at 1999. So kind of I put an imaginary line at 1999. And also note that on the vertical axis, this is the average natural logged price. For those of you in econometrics, you'll learn more about why you might naturally log a price, but these are not actual prices because it's a natural log. But what we can see is a trend, right? We're taking an average, and you've got an upward trend. So if you put an imaginary vertical line at 1999, doesn't it appear that the trend is upward sloping for ivory prices? So ivory prices seem to be increasing since the ban on ivory. All right. So again, for those of you that have learned about correlation versus causality, correlation, this just happens to be happening at the same time. Causality, one is causing the other. Which do you think this probably is, a correlation or a causality? It's probably a causal story, right? That banning ivory, just like banning alcohol, banning drugs, bids up the price of that thing that is now illegal. So I found some prices since the ban. We can get a sense of what has happened to ivory prices. So let's take a look. And remember, you've got some of these prices in your notes, but it might pay to have them all in one place. $34 a pound in 1986. We've already given you that statistic. Prices between $65 and $145 in 2000. But then we start seeing rapid increase. By 2016, the price is $1,500 a pound. So guys, what has happened to the price of ivory? It has skyrocketed, not just increased, but skyrocketed, right? So experts suggest that if we look between 1989 and 2014, that would be right after the ban, we see a 1,019% increase in the price of ivory. That's humongous, right? I mean, that's insane. Imagine if your salary increased by 1,000% or your rent increased by 1,000%, right? What is 100% increase? That would be a what? Doubling, right? So if price doubled, that'd be a lot. That's only 100% increase, right? Doubling in price. So again, correlation or causal story? Most likely a causal story. The ban suggests that it has led to drastically increasing ivory prices, not surprising. But here's the problem. Our illegal trade has continued, right? You guys have the graphics in front of you. And this is just a sample. This is just 1 year snapshot, 2011. And not necessarily even every country, but we're still seeing a huge amount of illegal trade. So, did the ban eliminate illegal trade? The answer is definitively no, it did not. Now, since the ban, this is a study on just China, all right? Because remember, China is a big player in this game, right? So this was an interesting study, a huge study. They looked at visiting a whole bunch of cities. They visited a whole bunch of markets. They looked at how many outlets were selling illegal ivory and then number of illegal products. Again, some methodology, but what are we seeing? They're going to 125 markets in 2017. They're finding 503 that are illegally selling ivory, and they're seeing 2,300 plus illegal ivory products. They do it again in 2018, but they go to more markets. They see fewer vendors selling illegal ivory, but more products. All right, it would be hard to say there's any decreasing trend there. It just seems like a lot of illegal ivory trade, right? So China, still a big player, even though ivory is illegal. And you can find, guys, lots of videos online showing people going in and talking to salesmen. It's clearly illegal ivory, and they will make up some story about it being bone or being vegetable ivory, tagua, that kind of stuff. It's just really silly. But clearly, poaching, illegal ivory trade is still an issue. So we're going to look at this again so we can understand what's going on. But here we're seeing some potentially good news on the left side of this graph. So while there's still huge amounts of illegal trade, we're seeing elephants go up. But then we get to 2008. And that trend starts to reverse itself because something special happened in 2008 that we're going to talk about. So the ban did raise ivory prices. It didn't control illegal ivory trade, but maybe countries are making more effort. They're better managing, maybe because of this ability to sell ivory if your populations are healthy. We do see some good news with elephant populations going up on the left, followed by a problem on the right side of this graph that we need to explain. But before we do that, we also need to acknowledge something important, and that is that elephants aren't in the same situation in every country. That countries have very different outcomes with respect to management of their elephant populations. So I found this great graph, and this is from the Great Elephant Census. This is a really neat place to get information. They have lots of methodologies that they discuss about how they do things, but they basically divide into 4 basic categories with some in between. So I'm just pulling the ones that are easiest to interpret. So if you are dark green, and you may need to take a look and make some notes on your graph, on your map, but if you're dark green, then your elephant population is growing at a sustainable rate. So green, we see some dark green in Tanzania. That says that they've got elephant populations growing at a sustainable rate between 2 and 5%. If you're in light green, that should have said growing greater than 5%. I apologize. Change that, please. The dark green, increasing greater than 5%. Greater than 5%. If you're light green, it's increasing between 2 and 5%. And I'll confirm that I have this right. I apologize. Between 2 and 5%. So if you're in the green means good. Things are on the right path. But if you're in yellow, your elephant population is falling. So we see here in Botswana, their elephant population is falling, but it's only falling at less than 2%. It's not falling dramatically, but it's not growing. But in the red areas, your elephant population is falling at more than 5% a year. And so we see definitely a number of red areas. So it does make sense then, if elephant populations are growing at very different rates across Africa, might some flexibility make sense? It might, except for the flexibility that we've afforded leads to some new problems that we're going to talk about. Before we do that, though, let's take a look at Zimbabwe. So Zimbabwe is one of those countries that was afforded the flexibility to sell ivory because they were doing a good job with their elephant management program. Specifically, Zimbabwe implemented a new program, and that's why they voted against the ivory ban. They're arguing, we are doing a good job. In fact, not just a good job, but we're doing something very innovative. We want to be able to sell ivory. So they voted against the ivory ban, arguing that they were doing a good job managing their elephants. So we vote against the ban. We're doing a good job. We don't want to be penalized. So we have this innovative program. And the innovative program is called the Communal Areas Management Program for Indigenous Resources. Communal Areas Management Program for Indigenous Resources. But it's nicknamed Campfire. So the Communal Areas Management Program for Indigenous Resources, nicknamed Campfire. Now this started around 1988. So this would be during that quota program, right? At the end of that quota program. And it kind of got started heavy duty the year of the ban, right? So they're like, wait a minute, we just started this cool program. Campfire, it's great, it's going to work. Don't do this to us. To assist with this program, Campfire and Zimbabwe's government has received financial support from the United States and specifically from our taxpayers. So you and I, maybe y'all, not y'all, because y'all weren't even born, but me, being the only one alive in that year in the room, I helped pay for this, I guess, right? Being an American taxpayer. So money was channeled to Zimbabwe through our United States Agency for International Development. You've probably heard of it, but usually we call it USAID. So the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, channeled funds from U.S. taxpayers to help Zimbabwe with this program. Which makes sense, right? I mean, after all, we kind of led the fight for the ban. We should put our money where our mouth is. So I think that makes sense. If we're going to push things on other countries, we should pony up a little bit. But it wasn't just a little bit. It was $20 million. So it's not small potatoes. $20 million. Now, the reason for this program is that people were moving to communal lands. And when we talk about communal lands, we're talking about kind of what we think about like the bush area of Africa, rural Africa, where things are not developed at all. So people are moving to these communal lands, out of the cities. Maybe it's because of population pressures. Cost of living gets very high in overcrowded cities, so as cities are developing and they're getting more overcrowded and rent goes up and cost of living goes up, it might make sense that you would see this. So people are moving to these communal lands away from cities where cost of living is really, really high. But the problem, guys, in these communal areas is that the land is really dry. So if the land is really dry, it's harder to grow crops. It's harder to grow crops. And so the people that live out there are subsistence farmers. What does it mean to be a subsistence farmer?
You only make enough for you.
Yeah, you're growing enough to support yourself, right? To feed yourself, feed your family. But what you're not going to be able to do is have huge amounts of commercially viable product. It's not like you're having these farms and then bringing your stuff to big markets and bringing in lots of revenue. So you're subsistence farmers. You're poor. You can feed yourself, but you're poor. So they need a source of income. They need a source of income for these communities that are starting to develop in the communal lands. At the same time, we need to protect the at-risk species. We need to protect the at-risk species. And didn't we already talk about, guys, that animals like elephants aren't safe from these villagers, right? That these villagers are mad because elephants are uprooting their trees, their apple trees, and trampling their crops and destroying homes. So we need two things in these communal areas. We need to protect species. We need a source of income for the people that live there. The campfire program merges those two together in an innovative way. So the campfire program achieves both of these things, source of income and protection of species, with a change in property rights. So the campfire program achieves these two things with a change in property rights. First, the campfire program gives the property rights to the villagers, to the villages and the villagers. So these property rights, instead of it being a common pool property, or even more so open access property, it's now the property of the village. The animals in your area belong to you. The animals in your area belong to you. So the idea here is to eliminate this tragedy of the common because there's no property rights. We've given you property rights. The animals belong to you and your village. The animals belong to you and your village. So we've given you the property rights. They belong to you. But here's my question. So we're all in a communal village together, guys, in the middle of nowhere. And we now own the elephants and lions and anything else on our land. Does that property right alone change our behaviors? Okay, so I own the elephant that is tearing up my house and threatening my spouse and maybe is going to trample my children and is about to eat all my crops that I need for my kids. Does it change my incentives just because I own them?
No.
Definitely not. So clearly, can this be all there is to the program? We just assign property rights, we're done? No. Clearly, this is not sufficient to cause a change in incentives. It's not enough. There has to be more to this because this is not going to change our behavior. What we need is a value for the living elephant. I value them dead because I've protected my family. I can take the ivory, I can take the meat, I can take the bones, I can take the skin, whatever else an elephant has, I can harvest. So we know that a dead elephant has a value, but the living elephant doesn't, because the living elephant's a risk, right? The living elephant's a big risk. So we need to have a way of creating a value for the living elephant. In other words, we need to decrease the incentive for the villages to kill the elephants. We need to create an incentive so that the villagers stop killing these guys. At the same time, we can provide an incentive for the villagers to fight against poaching. Villagers may not care much about poaching because let somebody else kill the elephant and protect my land and my crops and my house. So they didn't really have any incentive to keep the elephant alive or prevent poaching. So we need a way for these guys to make income and change their incentives. So how is it that we create a value for a living elephant? We've got to be innovative here. We need to create a value for the living elephant. So how do we do it? Opportunities for tourism. opportunities for tourism. Tourists want to see living elephants, not dead carcasses. So, here's how it works. The main vehicle in the campfire program is from big game hunting. Now, that does mean killing some animals. I'm well aware. But are the villagers going to kill them? And are they going to let too many get killed? No. So there's huge, huge money in big game hunting. People will pay enormous amounts of money to go participate in big game hunting. But it doesn't have to be just big game hunting. It can also be photography safaris. People will pay lots of money to be led into these communal lands to see species, take their beautiful pictures. And as we said, sport hunters will pay top dollar. So you're going to make a lot more money from sport hunting than you are from photographic safaris. Interestingly, I found a statistic that suggests that 76% of campfire hunters are from the United States. So I guess we love our hunting, and if we can shoot something really big, all the more exciting. So what ends up happening is that villagers who are part of campfire, these villages, market their facilities to safari operators and hunting safaris. So it could be a hunting safari, photographic safari. So the villagers are going to market their facilities. Hey, we've got a very animal-rich environment. We have good hunting. We have lots of opportunity to see species in their natural environment. And those tourists pay a daily fee to be there. So the tourists pay a daily fee. But usually when you go on a safari, it's not just for like one afternoon. It's usually for multiple days. And there can be other facilities that they make money on. They might run lodges, have food options. So, imagine going out in the bush and staying for 3 days and living in a little, lodge that's been built locally, a thatched hut. I think it would be great. But on top of that, guys, the real money is in the trophy fees. The trophy fees. There are trophy fees for what these big game hunters kill. Trophy fees. Trophy fees. And these fees can be really high. So in the past, and I was trying to find some more recent fees, but in the past, these are the fees that I've been able to find. The cost of going for big game hunting between $900 and $1,000 per day. Now that may include local guides and that kind of thing. Maybe meals, who knows. But that's a lot of money, am I right? That's a lot of money. $900 to $1,000 per day. And trophy fees are huge. When I found this data a few years ago, $10,000 trophy fee for an elephant. Now, I don't know if that includes them getting it prepared for you to ship home or whatever. It probably does not include the shipping, so there's probably other opportunities for locals to make money on top of this. But $10,000 for an elephant, $3,000 for a lion, $1,500 for a buffalo. You get the idea. Now, I found a 2007 discussion where some people were complaining that the fees had gotten really high, that they'd really upped these fees. So I thought that was really funny that they were complaining. I mean, gosh, they're already high. Like, what's another couple $1,000s? But they're still really high. But what I found in that discussion is that the elephant was costing $15,000. So I don't know, $10,000, $15,000. Maybe it's something in between, not sure, but it's a lot, am I right? Whether it's 10 or 15, we're talking about a pretty large sum of money. So clearly, guys, villages can earn significant income by participating in the campfire program. They can earn significant income. And the thing is that they get to retain that money at the community level. The community's got to do the work. They get to retain the money. So the money stays there. Yeah.
Sorry, quick question. Is it in Tanzania or Zimbabwe?
Oh, gosh. That should say Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe.
Okay.
Sorry.
Sure.
I have a good friend in Tanzania. I always have Tanzania on the brain, but it's Zimbabwe. I don't know where that came from. Sorry. So Zimbabwe. Thank you for asking that. I'll get that fixed. So the money gets to stay with the community, and they get to do some cool things. Medical clinics. They build schools. I read about one community building a grinding mill, which was kind of cool. So they were growing grains. Now they can grind them. And they were actually letting other communities rent the grinding mill, and they made some money that way. I also found discussion about building roads and then boreholes, which suggested that they were like wells. I don't know exactly what a borehole is. Maybe somebody here knows, but it was something for getting water. So maybe a rudimentary well or something like that. I don't know. But these are all cool things, right? Change the quality of life in your community, keep people safer, healthier, give them some education. But another thing that households potentially could get would be a payment to them directly. So you could choose to give some of the money to households directly. After all, households are going to have to be on board. Giving them some money might also be an okay thing. We also have to think about kind of the spillover effect in that there's some opportunities to create employment here, right? So when you build a medical center or a grinding mill, you create some jobs along the way. So that's exciting as well. The bottom line, though, is it's up to the community to decide how they want to use the money, if they want to keep it all communally, what projects they want to spend it on, if they want to give payments to households. It's their call. They are managing this. So between 1989 and 2004, so you're only talking about 15 years, it's estimated that Campfire raised $30 million. A lot of money. So this has been considered to be a success. Again, Zimbabwe. Ugh, what in the world? So still talking about Zimbabwe. Ignore Tanzania. We are not talking about Tanzania. Yeah.
How much did the campfire program raise?
30 million. 30 million. So, Zimbabwe, not Tanzania, Zimbabwe. But most importantly, guys, the incentives have changed. Everyone agree with that? The incentives have changed. So, you're no longer going to kill the species because it's a nuisance, right? You're not going to kill it because it's a nuisance. Question?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
How much was the startup cost of the program?
So that's a good question. So Ben's asking about the startup cost of the program, and I don't know. But remember, they got this, what essentially is kind of seed money from USAID, because clearly it's going to cost some money just administratively. There's oversight. We're going to talk about it in a minute. This isn't just, hey, figure it out, you do what you want. It is a very well structured and monitored, but that $20 million from USAID would have defrayed a lot of that. And that was probably part of the motivation of USAID allocating that money, is that this only works with the seed money. So you're asking some good questions. So incentives have changed. Villagers aren't killing animals anymore because they're a nuisance. They're not destroying their habitat, right? In fact, they want to protect the habitat because they want the animals on their land. They want to cohabitate with these animals. But they also now have an incentive to monitor for poachers, right? And so I've read accounts where the different households take turns, or they actually create jobs where people are monitoring at night. So they have kind of guards people. So either take turns, hire people, but we don't want the poachers killing our elephants. If anyone's going to kill our elephant, it's going to be some, big American with a ton of money in his pocket, right? But we're not going to let that just go on willy-nilly. It's got to be sustainable, right? Because we don't want to make all our money in year one and then, we can't participate anymore because there's nothing left. We've killed it all. So we have to proceed sustainably here. This doesn't make sense if we don't proceed sustainably. So we need to think about the opportunity to participate in this program both long run and short run. It doesn't make sense to exhaust all the resources in the short run. We need to be able to continue to make money and participate in this program in the long run. And so the communal villages work with government agencies. There's a lot of oversight for this. A lot of oversight. So again, remember we said that a program is only as good as its monitoring, its rules and its monitoring. So one rule is that with the government agencies, there will be determined kill quotas. And so they're figuring out how many elephants, for example, but it could be lions and other things, how many animals can be sustainably harvested while still allowing the population to thrive. And you have to stick to those. And in my reading, I saw reference to aerial monitoring. So some of the cost of this campfire program, and maybe some of the money you make has to go to pay this agency that's working with you, but they're going to be having aerial monitoring. And so they're going to be looking at your populations. Can they change your kill quotas, do you think? Yeah. Uh-huh.
So, did they have any laws about, what age of, the animals should kill?
Do they have laws about age of the animals? Probably so. I don't know, because I didn't do that kind of deep dive. But it would be interesting to know kind of exactly, when you showed up as a big game hunter, what rules applied to you. And my guess is there are some. There are some, right? So as interesting as this program is, and as effective as it's been, there's been some opposition to campfire that it's important for us to acknowledge that not everyone looks at this and says, yay, this is a great idea. So number one, we see, ignore the stuff at the bottom for a second, U.S., not human, but Humane Society. Put that E back on there. The U.S. Humane Society. Why do you think campfire receives opposition from the U.S. Humane Society? Yeah.
Because most of the money comes from hunting.
Because the money's coming from?
Big game hunting.
Hunting, right? Money is coming from hunting. So what's their objection? The money is coming from hunting. We certainly don't look like that. What other objection do you think they might have? The startup money came from?
Us.
Yeah, from us. We're subsidizing big game hunting in a sense, right? As taxpayers, we're subsidizing big game hunting. A second source of objection is from the villages who are not participating in campfire. The villages that are not participating in campfire. Guys, what do you think those villages have to say? So, we do have rural villages that do not get to participate. There's not any animals there. It makes no sense. So what do you think they want to have happen?
They probably want their own source of income.
They want a source of income, and they think it should come from where? Those who are participating, right? In other words, they want money to be redistributed. Let's take the money and let's redistribute it to all. Let's redistribute it to all. So let's think about, for a second, the arguments for and against. And let me fix this for a second. Hang on a second. Oh, my animation is not working, and that's my problem here. All right, well, Let's go back. There we go. Ugh, it's still coming in wrong. Okay. All right. So, should the money be redistributed to all? What would be the arguments for? Without reading anything at the bottom. What would be the arguments for redistributing, guys? It would help every village. It would help every village, and they're all poor, not just those with the elephants. What else might they say? Is it possible that there are some negative externalities or spillover costs for the villages that don't have a lot of animals? Maybe occasionally a stray elephant goes in and destroys their land, but you don't want them to kill it because you're making money from the campfire program, right? But could there be some cost to them? Yeah. But what are the arguments against redistributing this income? What's the arguments against? Those villages didn't have to contribute towards any of the work. What else?
The effectiveness of the program for the village.
Okay, might affect the effectiveness of the program, right? If you're taking money out of my village, why would I work so hard to protect these species, right? The bottom line, as this says, so at the bottom it summarizes that the arguments against redistribution, we shouldn't redistribute because the money needs to stay in the villages because that helps maintain the incentives. Am I right? If you're going to take a lot of money out of our village that we earned, why should we work so hard? But at the same time, for redistribution, is that other villages are poor too, and they also might incur some negative externalities. There might be elephants that find their way to the villages and destroy things, and they'd rather kill them, but the campfire villages don't want them to. You see the problem. All right, so we're going to end there, guys. We'll talk about what happened in 2008 with the resumption of ivory trade next class period and finish this up.